I preached a lot of sermons out of the Psalms in 2023. I suppose that, or 24 rather. I suppose that trend isn't reversing itself in 2025, at least not early on. I was drawn to a phrase in Psalm 103 that I wanted to talk about. I'm not going to spend time on the entire psalm, although if you have an opportunity to read it in this context, I think you'd do well to do so. I want to focus on the idea of being dust, as he mentions in verse number 14, and the overall Bible picture that we've been touching on in this space last few weeks. The idea of who we are apart from God and the role that we take in achieving something more noble, achieving something greater, higher than we were before, and God empowering us to do that through Jesus. And hopefully, throughout all of this consideration, there is always the credit going to God, the praise going to God. That's what Psalm 103 is all about. Not to diminish human beings at all, but rather to elevate human beings as being the ones for whom God is willing to have this kind of concern, this kind of involvement in our lives. He doesn't do this for stars and rocks and trees and flowers and gorillas, and as special as these things may be in their place in God's creation, they're not human beings. We are the ones who are remarkable. We are the ones that everything else is built around, and that calls us to a higher standard, a higher level of living, a moral standard, one that takes after our heavenly Father. We touched on this at Lakewood's Drive this morning, talking about Adam being a type of Christ. We learn in Adam what it means to be connected to God. We don't learn how from Jesus how it actually looks when it is completed, when it's perfected. We are striving toward that goal, and of course, we're thwarted at every turn because of our own weaknesses and failures and such. And that does not deter God, thankfully. That just causes God to look for ways to forgive us, to lift us up. He's willing and eager to continue to participate in this salvation process if we are willing. And that's the story of Psalm 103. And again, I don't want to get into a big long detailed discussion about the text. I'll skip down to say verse number 10 or verse number 9. He will not always accuse us or be angry forever. He has not dealt with us as our sins deserve or repaid us according to our iniquities. For as far as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his faithful love toward those who fear him. Notice all the credit going to God in all this conversation. As far as the east is from the west, so far he has removed our transgressions from us. As the Father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. For he knows what we're made of, remembering that we are dust. That's the phrase we're going to focus on here as we go. As for man, verse 15, his days are like grass. He blooms like a flower of the field. When the wind passes over it, it vanishes, and its place is no longer known. But from eternity to eternity, the Lord's faithful love is toward those who fear him, and his righteousness toward the grandchildren of those who keep his covenant, who remember to observe his precepts. So, what we're looking at here is a celebration of the love of God, the mercy, the compassion of God, who is willing to reach out to those who are, as he says here, but dust. Well, what does it mean that we are dust? I think clearly, at least in part, that goes back to the creation, doesn't it? Because in a literal sense, we are made out of dust in Adam, and eventually we will return to the dust. And from a purely chemical standpoint, that's what we are. We are carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen and some trace elements here or there, etc. But we're just elements, we're just things, stuff, just like the world around us. But God puts it together in such a way as to make us remarkable and unique in all of creation. And that's the story that we're getting in Psalm 103. That's what we get throughout the Bible. That the thing that is special about us as humans is not what we are in and of ourselves. What we are is dust. The thing that makes us special is when God acts upon us, when God imbues this dust with something special, with something remarkable, something unique. And I'm going to give you a few examples of how this works. Going first of all back to the beginning, Genesis chapter 2 and verse number 7. where he takes the literal dust of the ground, the little literal elements of the earth. He forms a human being, and then he breathes the breath of life into Adam, and he became a living soul. Depending on your translation, there renders more or less the same kind of way. Even after he's made remarkable, even after he becomes a human being, essentially, he's still not special until God literally breathes the breath of life into his lungs. He becomes a living soul. And of course, the word soul or spirit is used many times in Old and New Testament alike to talk about what distinguishes a human being from everything else. And I think that's the way it's being used here, that we became a part of God when he chose to give us life. He breathed life into us. You may recall the pardon me, the text in Ezekiel 37 where the dry bones, the valley full of dry bones are they receive skin and flesh and sinew and all the rest of this, but they're still not alive until the breath of life enters into them from God. That shows us in remarkable stark uh, language that it is God's inspiration, God's breath, God's spirit that allows us to be what we are at the very fundamental sense of who we are. We'll talk about more specific, more spiritual things as we go, but clearly a human being in and of itself is not especially remarkable, not any more than thousands of other things that we could point to in creation. It's remarkable, certainly. Anything that God did is remarkable. But you look at a corpse in the morgue, you go to a funeral service, and you see a loved one who's departed from us. He's physically still there in a sense at least, but we talk about being departed because what makes them remarkable, what makes them special is what God put there, and God what God put there is not there anymore, any more than it was with the valley of the dry bones or with Adam before God breathed upon him. That tells us in the first place how special life is and how sacred we should hold it in our own lives, the lives of our children, our grandchildren, society at large, etc. This is what makes us remarkable. This is the very foundation of what it means to be a human being. Now, if you don't believe that God created life, if you think that life more or less created itself in some primordial soup billions and billions of years ago, it would make sense why you might devalue the idea of human life, or at the very least, put it in some kind of cultural context. We may value it in this culture, and maybe across the country or across the world, they may value it less. Well, what difference does it make? Ultimately, it's all up to us. We're making our own world. We're making our own ethics, etc. When you accept what the Bible teaches about what you are as a human being, all that goes out the window because we realize that we are remarkable because God made us remarkable. And that's why the curse is placed on the shedding of blood in Genesis chapter 9 and so many other passages that we could turn to. It's just not right to be dismissive of the life that God gives us. It is a slap in the face, as it were. Now, beyond that, though, clearly there's a much deeper connection to that. It's not just that God made us alive; He made all kinds of things alive, as far as that goes, and that's remarkable. And I'm certainly not suggesting that human life is equivalent to animal life. But what's really amazing about the life that he breathes into us is the fact that it is spiritual in nature as well as physical. And that's true from the very beginning. We see that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, where God made man in his own image. Male and female, he created them. In what sense is that? How is it that we are made in the image of God? Well, that's a very deep and profound truth that I'm not sure I'm prepared to even share all the things that I do understand, and I'm quite sure I don't understand all of it. But at the very least, it means this kind of thing, that God is a moral, a spiritual, an ethical being who has certain requirements, who has certain base characteristics. He is the definition of ethical behavior and moral behavior. He is purity in every sense as far as that sort of thing goes. And when he creates human beings, he creates us to appreciate those kind of things. We get very excited when we see emotional responses from elephants or dogs or apes or whatever other kind of animal. Oh, it's like it's almost like they're human. Well, in that very limited sense, maybe. But there's no comparison between the ethical and moral conduct that you see in these animals versus what you see in human beings. The idea of elephants kind of tromping around a dead baby, essentially an elephant funeral, and seeming to mourn the passing of someone that they cared about emotionally. At least that's what it looks like to human eyes. In the first place, it looks like that because that's who we are. Because God made us moral creatures and emotional creatures, and we recognize that, or at least we think that we recognize that in other aspects. Even if you grant that animals have certain emotions and certain sort of kind of human characteristics, there's really no comparison between the nature of the animals and the nature of human beings. And surely the deepest, hardcorest evolutionary scientists would agree with us on that. Animals just don't look like human beings. They don't act like human beings. This is because we are made in God's image. And whatever kind of emotional or ethical or whatever other kind of character trait we may see in animals pales in comparison to what human beings do, and especially what human beings are capable of doing because of the spirit that's given to them in Jesus. We are children of God. We are his special creation, his family. In Luke chapter 3, verse 38, at the end of the genealogy that's given to us there, charting the connection of Jesus to one human being after another. It's not just that he was the son of Mary and Mary was descended from this person, Mary was, and that person was descended from this other person, and all the way back to Adam. It's not just that. It's saying that Jesus was the son of this person, that person, that. Jesus shares DNA with all of these human ancestors that he had. And the reason I bring it up, of course, is the backward genealogy that's given to us there caps itself not with Adam, but with God. He is the son of Adam, yes, but he is also in Adam the son of God. Now, that of course has profound implications in all other kinds of Bible study, but for our purposes here, we're emphasizing that Jesus, because he was a human being, because he was the Son of Man and all that that entails, that in and of itself connects him to God and shows us the way that we should connect to God ourselves by following after his example. All of the ethics, all of the morality, all of the character that we see in Jesus is a direct reflection, a the mirror image, as it were, of divine things. And so by imitating Jesus, we imitate God. By becoming more like Jesus, we become more like God. Animals simply cannot do that, let alone plants and rocks and all the rest of it. They can't do that. We can. And thanks to God, we do. Now, we're not going to do it perfectly, of course, as Jesus did, but that's what Psalm 103 is all about here. The idea of God being willing to work with those who work with him because we are willing to accept our legacy, because we accept and we believe that this is our calling to be what God had always intended for us to be. Because of that, we are able to rise to this standard. All the while, of course, giving God the credit because none of this would be possible if it weren't for God. If we wind up an inch short or a mile short or 10,000 miles short, what difference does it make? We're never going to be what Jesus was. We're never going to be what God calls us to be. That's why there's grace, because God loves us and God is participating in this process with us. That's what he does for us because we are his children. That's what we're capable of doing ourselves because we are his children. Now, a lot of people, of course, are going to reject that legacy. A lot of people are going to go in their own way, just like maybe a child of yours might decide, you know what, I don't care anything about being Hal Hammons Jr. I'm going to be whatever I want to be and reject the legacy that's handed down to him or her by their parents and grandparents, etc. That happens. And it certainly happens in the family of God. But it doesn't have to happen. You can choose to participate in this, and your failures along the way are not going to keep God from doing the thing that He has always intended to do with this special creation of His. Make them and remake them over and over, day by day, hour by hour, becoming more like He wants us to be. That is the calling that we are called to, the special calling, because we are, yes, dust after a fashion, but the most special dust there ever was, because we are connected to God in the Spirit. Now, there's another sense that I want to talk about also from Psalm 16 and the other passages also. The idea of returning to the dust, things, causes us to think about funerals and death and that sort of thing, which is a natural and to a certain degree, I think, healthy approach for us to take about physical things. We realize that this is the way of human beings, and that we, more than any other time, I suppose, in that moment, put our trust in God. We trust that He is watching over us. So many of the Psalms talk about God delivering him from the jaws of death, delivering him from the pit, etc. And certainly we see that in Psalm 16. We see God loving His people and rescuing His people, and I don't want to diminish any of that at all, because it's appropriate for us to pray to God in times of despair, in times of danger, etc. And certainly God has delivered His people time and time again in those kind of situations. Maybe He's even delivered you, maybe in a situation you didn't even recognize you were in at the time. But the bigger fulfillment of this is a spiritual fulfillment that happens not despite death, but after death, or not to thwart death, as it were, but to give in to death and then conquer death afterward. We find in Acts chapter 2, when Peter quotes this passage, that there's more to it than simply saving the life of God's righteous one, although clearly that's part of it, as David writes this psalm down. Backing up to, say, verse number 7. I will bless the Lord who counsels me, even at night when my thoughts trouble me. I always let the Lord guide me, because He is at my right hand. I will not be shaken. Therefore, my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices. My body also rests securely. For you will not abandon me to Sheol. You will not allow your faithful one to see decay. You you reveal the path of life to me. In your presence is abundant joy. At your right hand are eternal pleasures. Now, again, I'm sure at least in part, David is talking about the salvation he has received from his enemies, from the forces of evil, the natural forces, etc. David put himself in harm's way many, many times, and he was put in harm's way by others many other times. That is that's clear from the David story and from the human story as far as that goes. And again, it's entirely appropriate for us to pray for relief in these moments, because God does care about us and God does lengthen our lives. Maybe not as literally as He did for David, or as literally as He did for Hezekiah when he prayed and God gave him 15 extra years instead of a death sentence. It happens from time to time. Certainly it does. And if that's what your prayers are these days, if you have some kind of special condition, our prayers are with you as far as that goes. But the bigger thing is this: no matter what kind of deliverance He gives to David, or gives to uh, Daniel, or any other faithful one to you or to me, ultimately death is going to win, at least in the physical sense. We are all going to succumb to the natural processes that have been the case ever since the Garden of Eden. Death is in the world, death is going to reign in this world. We are going to lose our lives at some point. So this can't be an absolute truth. Nobody would take it as an absolute truth. It can't possibly be that God will not allow righteous people to die, period. It may mean that in a specific situation, but it might even be a specific situation for every single human being. But it certainly is not a universal truth. Nobody reads it that way, except when it is a universal truth, except when it is a greater resurrection than we might see at first glance here. Peter, again in Acts chapter 2, points to this as a testimony to the power of God to raise the dead, and the fact that He did raise Jesus from the dead. The idea of the resurrection of Jesus, as He testified to just 3 days after Jesus' death on the cross, as He continues to testify to 7 weeks after that. He says He will not allow me to, will not abandon me, Sheol, will not allow your faithful one to see decay. We all go to Sheol. We all suffer decay. The fact that Jesus did not is testimony that he is able to extend physical well, a physical life after a fashion, at least a different sort of physical life, but nevertheless give us life after the grave. Now somebody might say, well, this is talking about Jesus. Peter says it's and you just said how it's not talking about us. Well, in a sense it's not talking about us, but you turn to passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and see how the resurrection of Jesus is testimony to our own personal resurrection, and you realize that conquering the dust, the curse of the dust, as seen in the life of Jesus Christ, is a foreshadowing of our own victory, that we also will escape the dust. Not in the sense that we won't return to the dust at all, but that we will not remain that way. We will not stay in this destroyed state. God is able to bring us back from the dead and give us life and give us a body and give us a home after this life is over. So that's a remarkable thing for him to do to dust, obviously here. And again, as we've been seeing this entire time, the main point that I'm trying to get at, none of this would be the case if God didn't do it for us, if God didn't do it to us. God is able to give dust remarkable properties. He does it in the flesh, he does it in the spirit, and he does it in eternity. And we see it spiritually happening to us in the kingdom of Jesus, that this mere mortal, this piece of dirt, as it were, is able to be transferred from one kingdom into another. Again, because God does it to us through Jesus. Colossians chapter 1, verse 13 and following. He has rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of the Son he loves. In him, in Christ, we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. He, Christ, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For everything was created by him in heaven and on earth, the visible, invisible, etc., going through this entire context here. This transfer from one kingdom into another, this taking of dust and giving it glory and prominence and rule, prestige in this life, and especially in the life to come, all of this is accomplished because God chooses to accomplish it. And going back to the larger point that seems to keep coming up in this space week after week, the idea of who gets the credit, who gets the glory in all of this. When we are saved by grace, and we acknowledge that we are saved by grace, it is a nod to God who makes all things possible for us. It has nothing to do with whether we choose to get baptized or not, whether we choose to avoid sin or not. It has to do with who gets the credit, who gets the praise and the glory for this transformation that's taking place. We're just dust. How could we possibly deserve any kind of praise, any kind of special consideration? That's some really high quality dust there. It's no wonder he became alive. It's no wonder he started breathing all of a sudden. It's no wonder he's going to go to heaven when he dies or what. No, that's not the way dust is. Dust does not have that property. Dust only has that property when God puts that property in him or in it, if you will. And that's what he's doing for us. He has given the dust that we are and the dust that we will be at some point very special, remarkable, even godlike properties. And we give him the praise, we give him the honor for doing all these things. And the last thing in the world we want to do is throw that in the rubbish heap, to start acting dirty, if you will. Again, we need to be true to our calling. We need to lift ourselves up as much as we can while God is lifting us up, not sin the more that grace may increase, but live lives that acknowledge and appreciate and celebrate the remarkable beings that we are empowered to become because God has empowered us to become them. I hope that this encourages you to live lives of faith and purpose and commitment towards spiritual things that will lift you up out of the dust, the dirty kind of background that we are in because of our birth, because of who we are apart from God, and be empowered through the Spirit to become the kind of ones, kind of spiritual beings, children of God that He's empowered us to be. Thank you very much for studying along, and God bless.